And I'm going to be we'll filter the questions through me. Good morning. My name is Joe Fish-Kay. I'm Principal Research Scientist here at Mozilla in Mountain View. And today my pleasure is to... That's not even a sentence. Today it is my pleasure to introduce to you Mor Naaman. Mor is a professor at Cornell Tech and has been a long-time researcher in the field of human-computer interaction and computer-supported cooperative work. And I think his current work, in which he's looking into what it means to explore trust online, both in terms of trust in the sources that you read, but also trust in, shall we say, the trusted personal agent, which I'll remind you is part of Mozilla's True North right now that we're exploring. So I think this will be very relevant. I think the ties to the work that Mor is talking about right now, to some of the presentations we've seen previously, like the work that Jenna Burrell presented or the work that Kate Starbird presented, really point to a theme here, and it's very exciting to see that as part of the discussion. So, without any further ado, I introduce you to Mor Naaman.
Thank you. Great to be here at Mozilla. Thank Joe Fish for the invitation. And if people there, do we have remote questions at any time? Or so somebody's going to flag, I'm going to talk to you, and somebody's going to flag me because I don't see you guys out there. So this is a relatively brand new talk with some results that we're still working on interpreting and understanding, so bear with me. And just a few credits before I start. This is mostly work led by my PhD student, Maurice, at Cornell Tech, with other collaborators, PhD students, faculty, and others. And also a word of non-credit. I'm currently on sabbatical at Google here in Mountain View, but this is 100% Cornell talk. The work is not from Google, and I'm not presenting Google in any way in the talk. So, trust. Actually, let me do it in a John Oliver way. Trust. How's my British accent? That's good. That's good. Trust is why we go 5,000 miles and stay with a stranger that we've never met before. Trust is also why we can leave food in the Mozilla fridge knowing that it will not be eaten by others. Trust is why we can book speakers, inviting people on social media and remote locations to see them, knowing that they'll show up. And trust is also why we can eat out at restaurants. Joe Fish might recognize this scene. I don't know if young people do these days. So trust is often defined as the willingness to take risk or to make oneself vulnerable to other parties in hope for some future expectation of some future reward. Trust is fundamental for all our interpersonal interactions, for our transactions, for our relationships. But not only those. For our society to function, for our economy to function, we also need to trust institutions, various institutions and organizations. We do that, especially in Western societies, in multiple and daily ways. For example, we trust in government to mostly act on our behalf. We trust corporations like Mozilla with our data. And we trust the media to reflect the world to us and society and how it's functioning. We'll come back to media in a second. Altogether, trust, I don't need probably to tell this audience, is fundamental to the stability of our democratic societies. But how we trust each other has also shifted. Our social structures, our social interactions have shifted from face-to-face to social and online media, where our interactions, our consumptions, our institutions, our interactions and consumption of information with institutions and others are increasingly governed and sometimes generated by algorithms, by AI, by recommender systems, and so forth. Decisions to trust has moved to and are informed by technology platforms and algorithms. What happens to trust in these settings has been a topic my research has been looking at over the last few years. So we want to trust, understand trust in this new information ecosystem supported by technology. Notice that I'm not talking about trust in technology necessarily, but how we trust each other through technology in various ways. So here's the outline of this talk. I'm going to start with one thread that talks about trust in media, and I'll describe an online experiment where we ask people to evaluate headline claims, news reports, in partisan settings, much like the ones that we have online these days. The other thread, I'm going to introduce a new idea, a new concept, AI-mediated communication, and show how what the potential effect of that is on how we trust each other online. These are two online experiments, but there are other work in my lab of different types of work in my lab, including things that are more system buildings, data science, machine learning, anything from creating tools for journalists to support, to help them track visual misinformation, to understanding misinformation targeted political candidates online and social media, and understanding trust, for example, in social group and how that relates to misinformation. But I'm not talking about those today. We'll stay in the online experiment world. All right, trust in media. Again, I don't think this crowd needs a lot of motivation, but as you know, when we have social filters and aggregators, we change the way we think about, we trust the sources of that information. And in particular, media and journalism is increasingly very important for us to understand how people evaluate. As we know, the quality of democratic life depends on the public having the facts and being able to make sense of them. And it's also the purpose of journalism to provide us with this information, with these facts, so we can be free and self-governing, as the democratic idea goes. At the same time, media is also increasingly under attack, increasingly is or seen as partisan, increasingly manipulated with consequences of how we perceive it. For example, we know that the trust in media has been very low. You're seeing here from Edelman Trust Report, trust in media and government are lowest from all the other type of institutions they studied. It's also very partisan. Trust in media organizations is split along partisan dimensions. And this partisanship is what we focus on in the study that I will present. In particular, in this specific study, we were interested in how people, when they encounter news online, let's say in a feed, how will the evaluation of the news that they see will change as a response to politically congruent and incongruent headline claims or media sources. So when they agree with the headline or when they align with the source, how would that change their evaluation? So for example, if you're conservative, say, in the US, and you have a preference for Fox News, what would you make of a Fox News headline that says that a majority of Americans support the impeachment process? Are you going to say, yes, I trust this from Fox News, or are you going to reject it because it doesn't align with your worldview, regardless of your trusted source. And what will happen if that same headline was shown, say, by the New York Times? So I already hinted at a few things that might impact the evaluation when you encounter such information. So for example, one thing that will impact it is how you evaluate the source credibility. So the way you evaluate the credibility has to do with expertise that you assign to the source, but also those evaluation of those expertise is often impacted by your perception of how you share goals and values with that source or that organization. The other thing that may impact your evaluation is what's called motivated reasoning, sometimes directionally motivated reasoning, which leads people to seek out information and reinforces their view, sometimes related or happens through a mechanism we call confirmation bias, right? So this generally means that we view information that supports our worldview as more convincing than information that goes against it. So that's another thing that might impact our evaluation. The last thing we're going to look at is what's called expressive responding, somebody called motivated responding. And this is when you're presented with information that is opposed to their view, you know what the right answer is, but you will respond in a manner that supports your answer. So famously, an example, when there was a study that shows when Republicans were shown side by side Obama and Trump inauguration photos, they still said that Trump's was better attended. Right, so this is where they probably know the right answer, but still perform an answer that aligns with their views. So when we ask people to evaluate content online, all these are three of the factors that may be part of their calculation. So we can ask a more specific research question now. So how will the evaluation change? In particular, what is the relative impact of your alignment with the source versus your alignment with the claim? And whether there is any evidence of expressive responding, where you know the right answer but provide a different one. If I'm not going to talk about this latter one, you can ask me about that later, or maybe I'll briefly mention that if we have time. So to answer that question, here is what we did. We had an online experiment where we showed headlines that were randomly assigned to sources. So the headlines were either right or left-leaning, and the sources were either right or left-leaning. So this was the entire manipulation. And here's the one method slide if you want to pay attention. This is the one method slide that you need to understand. Like I just said, we took a left-leaning headline, and sometimes we showed it with a left-leaning source, and sometimes we showed participants the same headline aligned with the right-leaning source, and then we did the same with the right-leaning headline and mixed up the sources this way. Okay, I lied. There's one more slide to pay attention to. This is what we asked them. We asked them when we showed those headlines, and I'll show you in a second the more detailed setup of the experiment. We basically asked them to review whether the claim in the headline is true or false. So those claims that we used in the experiment, we had to be quite selective in which ones, or which headlines, which claims we've shown to the participants. So we wanted things that are representative of what people might encounter in their online news consumption. We wanted things that could be true or false, so they contain factual claims. We wanted claims that are clearly either liberal leaning or conservative leaning. And we wanted also claims that are difficult to identify as true. That's not everybody knows or everybody agrees that they're true or false. I'm not going to go into the details, but suffice to say that Maurice, the grad student in this case, went through a detailed process of data collection and validation, at the end of which we had 10 right-leaning and 10 left-leaning headlines that were evaluated as such in a pretest, with claims, specific claims that could be perceived as true or false, but that we, at least with our biases, evaluated as true. And they were not, importantly, not obviously true to participants in the pretest. Okay, so we had 20 such headlines to use two examples that you've seen before were part of it. Okay, so to choose our sources, so remember we mixed the headlines with sources. Sources we wanted to have widely recognized media organizations that most participants will recognize, but also those that are perceived as biased, as partisan, either on the right or on the left. So we ended up using 6 sources, CNN, HuffPost, and the New York Times as the one that are seen as left-leaning, Fox News, Drudge, and Breitbart as those that seem right-leaning. Here's what we did in the experiment setup. Remember, we had our 10 claims, 20 claims, 10 Republican-leaning and 10 Democratic-leaning in blue, and 6 sources. So when we had a new participant come into our experiment, we matched one at random, chose one liberal claim and matched it to one of the liberal sources. We took one conservative or right-leaning claim and matched it with one of the right-leaning sources. And then we did the opposite. We mixed up a left and a right claim with a left-leaning headline. So we had 4 such headlines in each version of the experiment. This is what we use. This is the data that we got from every participant, right? So we got from every participant 4 data points that mixed up headlines and sources. This would have been probably obvious to participants what we're trying to do. So we also mixed it up with a bunch of decoys. I'm not going to give you the details of how we generated those, but among the decoys, we've shown them 10 other headlines associated with multiple other sources, including 2 headlines that you see here in black that were fake news, very clearly fake news headlines. So when we asked them about things that are true or false, they could have always had in the study 2 headlines that are very clearly false, so they can choose that option. We also asked participants about their political leaning using various measures. You can ask me about later, but eventually we had the label of left-leaning or right-leaning for each of them. We asked them generally about trust recognition of the media sources and obviously demographics that I will not talk about in the analysis today. We ran it on Amazon Mechanical Turk. So we had 160 participants, meaning that we got 4 data points on the 4 items, experimental items from each of these people. And now we can start answering the question of whether people would swayed by source or whether they swayed by the headline that aligns with their view. Now, usually, maybe I'll walk around. Now, it will be hard for us to count. I usually ask people what they think. So maybe spend 1 second. I'll ask Joe Fish. I'll put Joe Fish on the spot. What they think had more impact, whether you aligned yourself with a source or whether you aligned with a headline, regardless of source. What had more impact on your evaluation of content?
I'm sorry to admit.
Yeah, so Joe Fish goes with the source. I think the majority of crowds that I present this to go with the source. A solid guess and one that we'll see in a second if it was true or not. So let me walk you through the high-level results. So this is, let's do it very quickly. So here we see the response of the participants to all the, every time that they saw a headline that was aligned with a left-leaning source. Right, so it doesn't matter, all the headlines, right-leaning, left-leaning, but associated with a left-leaning source. And the participants in blue, you can see that 56% of the time thought that was those headlines were true. And when we had the red participant, the right-leaning participants, 53, so a little less, 53% of the time, they thought those left-leaning sources, those claims were true. Okay. Now, 2 things. One thing to remember, all the claims, at least we evaluated all the claims to be true, so that we expect participants to agree 100%, right, if they actually knew the state of the world. to agree with those sources 100% of the time. This is true for all the results that I'll show you in a second. So let's see what happens when we have a right-leaning source, right? So if we think that the source and your alignment with the source has impact, we now expect the Republicans to believe the right-leaning sources a lot more and the liberals to believe them less. And indeed, this is the case. So when we show the information and the same claims randomly assigned to a right-leaning source, there is a significant drop in how the left-leaning crowd evaluates them versus the right-leaning. Notice, and we'll maybe come back to it, the shift is mostly with left-leaning, the liberal participants. There's very little change in how the right-leaning participants evaluate it. Okay, so this was the source. Clearly has some effect. Let's see the effect of whether or not you align with the headline. And you can see here that this effect was much larger. So regardless of the source, now we're aggregating by the claims. So every time you see a left-leaning claim, we can see that left-leaning participants tended to rate it as much as true in much higher numbers than the right-leaning participants, and that's flipped when we're showing a right-leaning claim. Again, one thing to notice is that the shift is mainly happening with the left-leaning participants and almost no movement with the right-leaning participants when they evaluate those claims. And again, I'll come back to that in a second. The warning, this is the initial analysis, but one can do this, look at this data and run a logistic regression predicting whether you will see a true or false response based on the different alignment criteria. So one thing that our regression shows that if you have an aligned source, you're 7% more likely to believe it. But if you have an aligned claim, you're 15% more likely to believe that. Where we have in general, the right-leaning claims was about 12% less credible. And that is related, of course, to the shift that we saw, but we're still analyzing to see exactly why.
I think we call that machine learning nowadays.
Yes, AI. I should have said AI. We had an AI predict the. Okay, so I'm using a stronger language here than what we showed in the experiment, but it's more the claim that the motivated reasoning has a stronger effect than the source, right? So even if Fox News reports something that is doesn't allow with your view, you might reject the source, even if you trust it, to choose your view over it. The other thing that we find is surprising asymmetry, that the left-leaning participants exhibit wider gaps and in general, the right-leaning headlines were less believed. This could be a function of the claims, the specific claims, or the specific media organization that we chose. The claims obviously had a more direct impact. However, we replicated the same phenomena with two other experiments. One of them used completely different set of claims. So I think that merits more investigation, and I don't know how to do it yet, but we're thinking about it. I didn't talk about expressive responding. Remember, this is when people know the right answer, but provide an answer that aligns with their view. We have a mixed evidence that that's going on from our studies.
There's a few questions about this particular study before we move on.
Yes, do it.
The question basically seems to be about sources. So both, how did you determine what sources were left or right-leaning, and whether the sources that you chose are necessary. So comparing the Drudge Report to the New York Times, those seem like there are some other factors other than merely left and right.
Oh my God, I showed I talked to a version of this work to a crowd of journalists, and they were very offended. And they forget the Drudge Report even by putting the Times and Fox News on the same.
Right.
Yeah. So obviously problematic, and we have the data of how people responded to each one of these organizations, and I don't have those results yet, but there are certainly differences. Even within participants on how they, but the trends I think were roughly the same.
Okay.
But absolutely not ideal. The reason I think we were almost kind of stuck with these is that because these are the only ones that are widely recognizable, so people know them, and people know their bias as well.
Yeah.
Drudge report, I would maybe remove from the next iteration of this, just because of recognizability. But yes, I also I had a little notice here, right? We're talking about media organization, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily journalistic organizations. So
I mean, there is a point that it's not quite clear how far left you have to go from Breitbart. In Britain, we have a paper, The Daily Worker, which my grandfather used to get.
Yeah.
I'm willing to believe that one, but I don't know of.
Yeah. But
you have to go pretty far left, right?
Well, it turns out less than you'd expect based on the perception. So we used there are a couple of studies that measure the perceived biases of each of these organizations, and these are actually roughly balanced on the right and the left. I mean, not exactly, of course, because we can't choose it, but doesn't feel like in our public perception. Sure. In the U.S., it doesn't feel like it's that imbalanced.
Well, there's also a little bit of a concern that you're polarizing, by the definition, by the choices you're making, you're polarizing the discussion, right? As in defining, say, the CNN as left-leaning. Mm-hmm. When I know that the right defines CNN as left-leaning. I feel like a lot of people on the left define CNN as pretty right-leaning. And when you look at the graphs of sort of correlation, it's somewhere in the middle of things.
Well, absolutely. I'm also obviously collapsing left and right leaning into a single dimension, which is absolutely not the case in political reality. Although I would say that despite again, I mean, I think the perception within the general population is that CNN is left leaning and is seen almost equivalently as left-leaning as Breitbart is right-leaning. So yeah, we can reason about that and talk about that. But we ran on.
We have one more question. I'm going to let you go on soon. But one more question that people weren't sure about. The headlines that you chose, were they all 100%? Were they all true?
100% true.
They were 100% true. Okay.
Yeah. We evaluated them as true. So the two that you saw, for example, Trump Mar-a-Lago Strip cost $13 million. We manually evaluated each one of those headlines as true.
Okay.
But there was a recent study, and I forget, just I'm now blanking on where it came out. It was just 2 weeks ago that showed also an evaluation of claims that were all true, and the agreement rates in their study were also low as in our study, which is surprising. It was surprising to us.
And one more question. Yeah, I mean, I think this question of like how do people independently rate these news things. I know I've seen some work on that, and that would be interesting to dig in more with more than a binary left or right. It would be interesting to sort of see whether there's a scale. I think I would feel pretty strong about making the case that Breitbart is further to the right than CNN is to the left.
Yeah.
But then again, as an immigrant, my sense of politics in the United States is always a little bit off. Like it's always slightly more right than I expect it to be.
Yeah, and I don't remember how those studies, but I can point to whoever's interested to some of the studies that we looked at. And yeah, but I agree. It's not, it's perception, how you ask, but in general, there are a number of studies that show that.
And I'm going to ask you one more question on this, and then I'll let you go, which is, did you have a sense of the average veracity of the media outlets? That is to say, just given the media outlets without any associated information, to test whether the response are conditioned by the sources per se to tend to disbelieve, or like a priori prior to giving them any statement.
We have the data. I don't have it in the analysis right now, but we have for each participant how they evaluated generally, how much they trusted each one of those organizations that we asked about, and a couple of others. In initial work, there was obviously a lot of correlation, but it's kind of in a way expected, right? We expect right-leaning, left-leaning people, we know that from the previous studies, to trust the right and left-leaning sources differently, but we wanted to see if that's actually a stronger predictor than their alignment with the claim itself.
Cool.
And it turns out, I mean, one, so you know, the double challenge here is that we have. I'm gonna take it forward, and that that even when you have a source that you trust report some information that rejects or goes against your worldview, you're still gonna reject that worldview, right? So, which is perhaps a little bit troubling, right? So here. What I'm asking for next steps are, you know, what kind of other questions we can ask that might impact how people trust in news and how we can improve that. This is a big question, something that we're thinking about. Another question is, you know, it's not just the filter bubble, right? It's not that this study and others clearly show that it's not about showing content from Fox News in your feed if you're liberal or the other way around, because to learn from people, to learn from those views that we see, we also must trust them enough to believe what they share. And this is not even, you know, even if you see Fox News doesn't align with the view, it's not even just about the source. It's really a problematic setup that goes beyond the question of filter bubble. So we'll come back to that at the end a little bit.
Let's come back to that.
Yeah.
And thank you for letting me derail you in the middle.
Yeah.
But I didn't want you to go on to the second bit, which is sort of a different topic without...
Yeah, no, these are all great,
Sure.
Great question. And,
Thank you.
Let's talk about interpersonal trust. This is a little bit of a big switch to a slightly different domain. And here, we ask about how we directly trust each other or other people. So, interpersonal trust, if you think about the sharing economy, for example, Uber, Airbnb, despite the decline in general trust, so trust in institutions, we seem to want to trust each other a little bit more, right? We jump into strangers' cars, we stay in Airbnb with Airbnb hosts and so forth. But not for long. AI is coming in and maybe will undermine our trust in each other. And let's see how. And first, let me talk about what we think is a new concept in how we communicate with each other. So traditionally, we had computer-mediated communication, right? It's the idea that we communicate with each other through technology, but we also assume that the sender adapts to the channel, whatever they're using, text messaging or video conferencing or whatever. They'll adapt to the channel to craft their message, but the message as they created it will be transmitted to the recipients. So right now, you are seeing me, and this is pretty much a neutral evaluation of the pixels that are captured by the camera. Increasingly, though, we have communication channels where an agent in the middle can participate in the communication act, suggest edits, do modification, or generate the entire communication on our behalf. On a paper that will appear at JCMC, Karen Levy, Jeff Hecking, and I call that AIMC, or AI-mediated communication. So these are interpersonal communications that are optimized, augmented, or even generated by algorithms to achieve specific communicative or relational outcome. Let me give you some examples. Many of you probably use Gmail, or there are very other clients that allow you to generate auto responses now. And here, for example, we have my student Maurice emailing me with his dissertation proposal, and these are some of the suggested responses from Google. So this is where AI comes in, and notice that it's providing not only some suggestions, but also a tone that even if I don't take the suggestions, I may be impacted by. There are other places in more different contexts. For example, LinkedIn can auto-generate your profile description from the details of your CV. more involved is Google's Duplex that can have entire conversation on your behalf, reflecting on your relationship with others by, for example, calling a business. And this is just current day and mostly text-based examples of such interactions. In the future, AI can have a even greater impact on our communication. For example, AI can make your text or maybe even your face seem more trustworthy, even in live video conversation, right? So you can take me and maybe change my face in a way that will make you trust me more. It will make me look at the camera. In fact, some phones already do that. So with the impact on your evaluations of who you're speaking to. New AI can depict you dancing like a professional or lifting heavy weights on your online profiles, for example, without you having to actually do that. Or it can, for example, optimize your message or appearance for maximum persuasion for each specific recipient. For example, it can give me an accent that is localized to any one of these locations that we're currently broadcasting to. So to start looking into this world of AI-mediated communication, we had one very simple research question, which is, will people evaluate others differently if they think that AI was involved in altering the other person's profile? Right, so this is very much restricted to profile settings, and in fact, as I'll show in a second, to Airbnb. So why would they evaluate AI-written profiles differently? One assumption said that there'll be no change. There'll be indifferent. There's some studies that show that in other contexts, people have not changed their evaluation. They could see this as more trustworthy. AI-generated profiles, because there is a machine heuristic, algorithmic authority. They said the computer wrote this, the computers don't lie. They'll believe it more. They can also believe it less because adding AI will maybe add more uncertainty about AI or about the person who wrote the profile, and believe it less. I'm going to ask you again, Joe Fish, which one you think happened, so you better memorize this. But let's make it concrete first. We used Airbnb as a research context. I showed you Rick before in the beginning of the talk. This is a very high trust situation. Not only it's interesting for that reason, we also had a lot of data and reliable measures of trustworthiness from our previous studies on Airbnb. That was not in AI MC world. So it was a great place for us to start. And specifically, we asked about Airbnb, will potential guests evaluate the host differently if they believe AI was involved in altering the host profile? So again, we did an online experiment, like I mentioned, and we led people to believe that certain profiles that they evaluated were written by AI. We had a label on profiles that said generated profiles. Not always, but that was the manipulation you'll see in a second. In fact, when we told them this is happening, this is how we showed them this was happening. We basically showed them a GIF of a profile getting automatically generated. Okay, there are two important things to note here. One is that we didn't use the word artificial intelligence. We said generated by computers or something like that, optimized profile or whatever, something like that that did not use AI as we thought people might react negatively already. Some people might react negatively to that phrase. And the second, that all the profiles that we use, just like all the headlines were true in the previous study, here all the profiles were actually written by hosts. There was no AI was harmed in the making of this research. Everything was written by actual Airbnb hosts. So here's the first experiment. It was a very simple setup. Here we had 10 profiles. All participants rated the same 10 profiles for trustworthiness. We selected 5 that we knew from previous studies are usually getting high trustworthiness scores, and 5 that are getting usually would get low trustworthiness scores. And in one condition, we just showed it to our participant and said, these are Airbnb profiles, rate them for trustworthiness. And in another condition, we showed the same profiles to other participants, and we told them these were written by AI. Please rate them for trustworthiness of the host. So that was the setup of the experiment. Again, we ran this on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and now let me just show you the results for the written by human, right? So this is the participants that were told that these profiles were written by Airbnb hosts. As you can see here, we have 10 participants, and we have the trustworthiness scores on the y-axis for each of those participant aggregated, averaged over all the raters, everybody that rated them. One thing to look at is the reliability. We still have 5 high trustworthy and 5 lower trustworthy profiles. So this measure of trustworthiness that we use is pretty reliable. So now let's see what happened when the same profiles were rated by people that thought that the profiles were written by AI. Joe Fish, higher trustworthiness, lower trustworthiness?
I'm going to assume that if you tell people that AI is involved, they're going to treat it as less trustworthy.
Less trustworthy.
But I don't know whether I'm exposing my own biases here, right?
Yeah, possibly.
You know,
so let's see.
Who doesn't love AI, right?
Who doesn't love AI?
Well, yeah.
Well, it turns out it was a trick question, but because there was no difference at all. In fact, spot on, every single profile, people evaluated in the same way. But you know that if this was our final results, I would not have shown you this work today. So I will continue and show you when we think there is actually a difference. Okay. So that was the first study. But what we did in this study was very separate, right? They either evaluated AI or they evaluated human profiles. But we asked, what happens if those profiles are mixed? So they're sometimes seeing AI-written profiles and sometimes they're seeing human-written profiles in the same system, right? So we had experiment 2. We had the same 10 profile, and now we didn't tell them. We told them that they were either written by a host or by AI. I'm not going to tell you about this experiment. I'm going to tell you about another experiment that is even more elaborate that asked the same question. And this one was more elaborate in that we chose the profiles differently. Instead of choosing high and low trustworthiness profiles, we chose profiles that we evaluated with participants in advance that look like they were written by AI or did not look like they were written by AI. I call it AI-ness, right? So the assumption is that some profiles people will think are more likely to have been written by AI, and some are less. Let me give you an example. This is from a pretest, right? So, and it was fairly, as I'll try and say, very reliable. Here is a profile that was rated high on the AI scale. Hi, hello, I am Sebastian, originally from Berlin, Germany. This was got a high AI-ness score. And this one, let me open with a huge hello to everyone reading this, was rated as low likelihood to have been written by AI. Right? So we had 30 such profiles. For each participant, we chose 5 random high and 5 random low AI profiles. And we had a number of conditions. I'm going to show only 3 of them. We had a few more. In one, we did the same thing. We told them these were all written by the host. In the second, we told them this may have been written by the host or may have been written by AI. And in the third, we labeled them. Everything that looked like AI, we actually labeled AI, and everything that was not, we labeled as, we didn't. We labeled as, assuming that was a person. Okay, let's see what happened now. So here we're comparing the overall scores for all the profiles that were in the AI, that looked like AI versus didn't look like AI. So you actually see when we told, this is the first control condition, so we didn't say anything about AI. So the participant thought that all these profiles were written by the host, and they rated the AI profiles, the higher. They had higher trustworthiness scores in this control setting. However, when we told them that these are mixed AI and human profiles, there was a decrease in trust for everything that looked like AI and an increase for everything that looked like human. So remember, they were not labeled, right? This is just the assumption of they look at the profile, they kind of think it was AI, they trustworthiness settings grow. When the same profiles were labeled as AI, there was even a more significant drop where people lowered even more the trustworthiness scores for those same profiles compared to the human profiles. In fact, we had another condition where we collected some data on how much participants thought something was AI when they gave it a trustworthiness score. And we can see that even when there was a slight suspicion that something was AI generated, the trustworthiness score already plummeted.
Cool.
So there's no effect on AI on rating except where the content is mixed. So when we have this world of mixed information, we have the AI labeled or AI suspected profiles receiving lower trustworthiness rating for the scores. We used in the paper, this was published in CHI 2009, we talk about how this might be explained by the elaboration likelihood model.
2019.
2019? Did I say 9?
Yeah.
No, we only thought about this last year. We talked about how this might explain by the elaboration likelihood model, right? So when we have a mixed source environment, maybe that makes the source of the profile or thinking about the source more salient and leading participants to engage in more careful processing of the profile. The theory calls it a central route, and therefore causing them to reduce their score. Regardless of what theory explained it, we did give it a new name. We called it the replicant effect, with apologies to Philip K. Dick and Ridley Scott. Because in our experimental world, populated by both humans and non-human agents, the replicants, in such an environment, the knowledge or even suspicion that something is a replicant, the profile is a replicant, results in distrust. Finally, one interesting finding was the idea of AI-ness. People had strong suspicion and reliable suspicion about what makes a profile AI, what makes it likely to be written by AI, and when it is more likely written by a human. We talk a little bit more about that in the paper, but we plan to do much larger studies that understand these perceptions better in multiple settings. In general, I think there are a lot of interesting questions to be asked about AIMC, including where we started is how it might impact and what kind of lasting effect it will have on trust. So in our interactions or relationships going forward as well. The second, even more immediate questions you can ask is how it might impact language use and communication effectiveness. For example, my colleague Jess Hohenstein and Martha Young at Cornell showed that, first of all, the language that is used by the smart replies is very positive. It might cause or might help prime you to use more positive language. This is an experiment that we're working on expanding. But also, in a new paper, that blame for communication outcome is associated differently if AI was used in the communication. So this is people doing a task, using AI or not using AI, but you're asking them about blame where the task failed, and that turns out to be different when AI was involved. And finally, there are important policy questions of how we should build and design these technologies into product. Should the use of AI be revealed, for example? How do we feel about the homogeneity effect of language and maybe even appearance that can result, and so forth. So many different questions that we should address. as we plunge into this world of AI-MC. All of these questions that I mentioned and some of the studies you can get from this working, not quite the final version of the upcoming JCMC paper. So this is bit.ly/AIMC-paper, case sensitive. But let me go back and talk about trust before we close. As I make the case in the beginning, without trust, our democracy and our society cannot function. In this talk, I showed how the partisan tendencies impact our evaluation of content in our information ecosystem and therefore impact our shared fact base. I also showed how AI involvement in content generation may challenge our evaluation of trustworthiness of others. These trends will obviously continue. Increasingly partisan content, fake or real, will continue to push us to silos of anger and distrust online. That's hard to see from this research how we can overcome those. More exposure to these increasingly troublesome trends, all the way to deep fake, which are maybe an extreme form of AIMC, will undermine our trust in any content that we see online. Text, video, image, interpersonal or otherwise, AI generated or not. When this happens, our assumptions about how our institutions, our system operate and can be trusted and how we can trust each other may not allow us to trust in the same ease and regularity that we do today in online and maybe even offline settings. And this might have dire consequences. If you read, Joe Fisher, have you read Fall yet?
No, I just gave it back to the library because I couldn't bring myself to pick up this 900-page book.
That's right. So let me give you a little spoiler. It's not really a spoiler. It's a 900-page book, and I'm going to talk about page 200 or so. In Fall, Neil Stevenson imagines a dystopian but not far-fetched future that is dominated by disinformation. And in this book, a group pulls a massive hoax that aims to convince the world that Moab in Utah was destroyed by a nuclear explosion. This group, the perpetrators, were meant to cause enough panic for society to reconsider the very basic elements of our information ecosystem, the internet, or the miasma that's called in the book. That those are the ones that allowed the hoax to happen. It may be time for us to consider a similar move. I don't mean that we need to orchestrate a hoax of nuked Moab, but I do think that we need to rethink the infrastructure of how we trust each other online. Trust, of course, is a wicked problem. There is no obvious solution to it. There is no stopping condition to know that you're done. It requires multiple stakeholders and many disciplines to tackle. Technology makers, policy people, education, media and journalism, and yes, organizations and such as Mozilla. Some of the questions we can ask on how to solve it include continuing to understand and research how people trust each other and what can impact that trust. And there's a lot of focus on misinformation research in the last few years, but how human-to-human trust is established, undermined, and evaluated in an online system could and should be continued topic of research. We also need to understand how to design, develop, and evaluate systems and infrastructure that help promote and maintain trustworthy and credible content, which is not the case on the web today, where we have systems that perhaps do the opposite. And finally, we need to understand what policy, ethical, and regulatory frameworks can support these systems. And we need to do it probably today. In the meantime, I would leave you with my Twitter handle, a lovely photo of the Cornell Tech campus at night, and I'm happy to answer any question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Here, I'm going to single-handedly clap for you. There's a couple of questions. So I'm going to ask one, but then first I'm going to give you one from Jared. I don't know where he's sitting, somewhere in the world. I have no idea. His local time is 1:53, so what's that, Chicago, something like that? Anyway, are there communication mechanics that can modify or increase trust, such as encryption, verified identities, digital signing, anything like that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because all these contract mechanisms are not always increasing trust, right? So in some cases they replace trust and make us not need to, basically you're not taking risk anymore, right? So they may work in some limited settings and may help with that, but they're not going to be helped more generally where trust is really a system where you make yourself vulnerable. Right, so I think there are things that you can do, anything from content verification to exchange, support and exchange, but it's not going to be our only solution.
I have a more fundamental question, which is, so I'm not convinced the word trust means anything. I think I've lost any track of what it means.
Yeah.
And in particular, I'm interested in trying to understand, let me tell you a particular case study. So one of the efforts that we're doing is around Web of Things, right? Which is trying to say, well, we should have an open source set of interactions with Internet of Things, right? And we have this problem that, of course, we're up against some of the biggest companies in the world, as is our want, right? Like we seem to do that a lot. But if you look at Amazon and you say, well, do people trust Amazon, right? And people say yes. And then you say, well, tell me what you mean. When was the last time you trusted Amazon? And what they mean is, when I click on USB cable and it says this will be delivered in 2 days, people believe that the USB cable will be delivered in 2 days. The question is the degree to which that bleeds over to, I think this company should have an open microphone in my house, or these questions of trust that go cross domains, because both of the cases you looked at, it's sort of one thing, right? Like you're not asking, do I trust Breitbart as a consumer? No, I don't, right? Like I happen to disagree with the information they present. Do I think they're going to steal my credit card information? Well, they're a big company. They're probably not going to steal my credit card information. So those questions about what is this trust and how does that manifest? Have you seen any work that talks to that question?
Yes, and let's separate the two things, right? And I think you're correct to point out that trust in information is a little bit different than trust where I make myself vulnerable, right? So it's not quite the same thing. In our work on trustworthiness, we ask specifically about different factors of trust. So we asked about, this is from Meyer in 1975. Paper, and he talks about benevolence, he talks about integrity, he talks about ability. And that's also true perhaps for organizations as well. And making those decisions on how, for example, you make yourself vulnerable to the Amazon microphone versus whether or not there's a lower risk situation where they send you a USB cable, could be impacted by your evaluation of the company in those dimensions.
Yeah.
So I definitely think there is a relationship there. There is an evaluation that's being made, and there is impact on how people evaluate these corporations and how they use the products.
Yeah. No, I think it's going to insert further research here, right?
Yeah.
I have one more question. This is from Benjamin. Our last guy was in Toronto. Maybe Ben is in Toronto too. I don't know. Do explicit labels on machine-generated content improve perceptions or trust of human-generated content?
We have in our data...
It's sort of the missing column, isn't it? It's
Yeah, no, we do have the human rating seems to go up a little bit, but the results I cannot say with certainty. I think something is happening where people trust the human content more, but I cannot say that for sure. Definitely the difference had changed. So I think there's multiple effects here, right? So the idea that when you have this mixed content, then people will trust the human labeled one more, or I don't know if it will go up, but definitely you trust it more. What will happen if some people start using this content, but suddenly if it's not exposed, for example, your human written profile, say, could be suspected as AI, as we've shown, and therefore suffer as well without any action on your part. I think there are fascinating questions to be asked and measured in those settings.
Yeah. Well, and I think again, there's some interest in that particular case. There's this interesting question: how much do you trust Airbnb, right, as the underlying platform that is able that because again, the failure mode there is sort of becoming something that people are aware of, right?
Yeah.
And there's both the failure mode, and then there's sort of these ethical considerations about how much do you, are you concerned that Airbnb is like taking away housing from regular people?
Yeah, so there
and
is
what
a corporate
that means for trust,
but not only, right? Because we think I think the matter of Airbnb only works because people trust the platform and mostly trust the other individuals on the other side. What we see an impact of such technology is perhaps in the fairness of how they trust the others. So people will end up with the Airbnb host, but they may be consistently selecting one host over the other because of the perception of language that the host uses. So I think Airbnb is already, luckily for them, it's a company for now. Putting aside their impact on local economies, people are willing to trust, but they're making those decisions in an informed way. Let me just give another example. Right, you have the similar gaze fixing that the Apple. I think Apple devices do now, right? So they can make you look at the other speaker when you're having a video conversation. Again, this is a simple use of AI, may impact your evaluation of trust, may also have a direct impact on people who are not using it. We don't know which way, right? If you're not using it, you may be seen as less trustworthy because you're not looking at the camera, but you also may seem as more trustworthy because you know that the looking at the camera part is fake.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I wonder how long these cues that we sort of currently treat as signals, right? I mean, people are pretty good at learning noise and signal, and as signal changes into noise, people are pretty good at picking that up as well.
That's right. So there will be long-term consequences. I think the same, again, another of my favorite examples is Gmail, right? So if Gmail basically trains us to respond in an overly positive manner to mundane day-to-day questions, what would it mean if I pick, well, first of all, would I be primed to use this kind of language? And what would it mean for people who are not using it and will just now, yes, I do want to join you for the movies today, without an exclamation point, and you'll be seen as having a different kind of interaction suddenly. Without nothing else changes except the other people using AI.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to wrap up because that's all we have time for. I'm going to single-handedly here thank you very much, but I want to assure you there's a whole bunch of other people out there.
Yeah, thank you to all the remote people and their questions.
Thank you very much.
Good to be here.
Thanks, Chris.